To get the most out of your suspension bike, you need all the parts working together. And, well, it's easy to overlook suspension bearings because, well, they're in the frame and sometimes it's tricky to get them out. But it's not. With this walkthrough, we'll show you how easy it can be. Different bikes will have different bearing systems, and I don't just mean if you've got a single pivot or a 6-bar multi-pivot suspension system. No, I mean all the bikes will have different bearings and in different places. Okay, the single pivot might have the same bearings on both sides, but it might not. There's a huge variation in not only the bearing type that you're going to put in, but the actual dimensions and inner dimensions and outer dimensions of these bearings. It does sound quite overwhelming, but lots of brands do a really good job now of listing what bearings you need, giving you exploded diagrams. There's lots of support as well from bearing companies as well to help you choose the right bearing set that you need, because there is so much variation. But do a bit of homework before you start this task and it's going to help you a lot later. Bearings. They're a coverall term, and we'll go through some of the kind of basic or key things that we've got. Essentially, they're there to have two fixed things moving freely. What are they? Well, often we think of ball bearings as the only bearings, but there's a lot of variation. And actually, there's a lot of variation with just a ball bearing too. Essentially, we've got an outer, often steel race structure, and then we've got a steel, often steel, inner structure. The diameter and the width can vary greatly, as can that kind of setup of ball bearings on the centre. You could have double row bearings. You can have roller bearings where instead of a ball, we've got a sort of rod assembly. You can have axle ones that allow for a bit of variation. They are rarer on mountain bikes. But yeah, there's lots of different versions and lots of different sizes. We've also got bushings and slide bearings. These might seem different because there aren't any moving parts, there aren't any rollers or moving bits, but they still are bearings. They still allow those two parts to move freely. Nearly all the bearings that we're discussing here will work better with grease. Okay, there's different greases for different jobs and different applications. But in short, the grease that we're going to have on the bearings, on the outside of the bearings to a degree, are doing two things. One, they're creating an extra slide layer. So whether you've got roller bearings or you've got ball bearings and they're moving inside a race, we're creating a contact area. So we're creating a barrier between those two things. And that's really good because they slide and work better, especially under load. The other thing that they're doing is sealing out contaminants, be that water and grit or mud, and even dust. So it's twofold, and it's really important to get the right grease in there. How to decide on whether just refreshing the bearings, that kind of messy but possibly useful task, or replacing them. Well, like many maintenance tasks on a mountain bike, we've got to be systematic. So we're going to partially disassemble the bike. Don't worry, it's not too taxing. We're going to take the back wheel out, we're going to take the shock out, and then we're going to cycle the suspension, the rear suspension system, and see how it feels. See if there's any tightness. See if, with a little bit of side load, if it starts to make noise. And if they're really tight and they're really kind of gummed up, it's time to replace them. And we're going to give you the tools on what tools to use to do that replacement and show you how to refresh them as well. And we're going to start with just how you might address this bearing just down here. We're going to take the dust cap off. We're going to try and look at the bearing inside and give it a refresh. With this yoke here, we're going to actually take it off and give you two different techniques of getting the bearings out from the frame and replacing them. I'm taking out this bolt on this side, which should free up the whole of this seat stay assembly. Just be mindful that often when you've got suspension parts, there's often little spaces in between them, and that's why it's really important to study that exploded diagram of your bike before it explodes in your workshop. Because if you lose any of these spaces, if you're lucky, sometimes they come with the service kits that you can get, but other times those spaces are unique to your bike. So make sure that you've either got a rag or your hand ready to catch those spare loose parts. With the bearings free of any kind of loading, you can actually rotate them and see how they feel. Just be mindful that the bearings in here are designed to kind of move in a sort of like full loop. And often they're only moving a small, short distance. So if you just rotate them around, you can get a good idea of if there's just excessive wear. These ones actually feel great, but I feel like where they are, they probably could do with a top up of grease. Using a sharp knife, we're just going to carefully slide underneath the lip seal. Just really gently, just being careful not to damage the rubber lip. And we can see we've got, well, loads of grease still in there. That's great, but you can see there's lots of grease in there, but it could do with a top up. We'll just work our way around, cycle the bearing around, making sure that we've got good level of grease all the way around. We're going to carefully reinstall this rubber lip seal. Just be really careful to make sure that it's fully seated. Hear it pop. Be really careful that you're not actually piercing through the lip seal. Just cycle it round and then wipe off any excess. Before I reassemble this section, I think I want to have a look at this yoke here. We've got some bearings seated in it, and it kind of flags something that's really, well, annoying, but also really key to flag up, is that sometimes you're going to get bearings and access to bearings in really awkward places. And sometimes the tools that you've got, you just won't be able to get in. Park makes some really cool, dedicated, short hex keys that sometimes can allow you access, but sometimes what you need is a really small ratchet. Topi make one that's really small and really slim, and is going to give me the access that I need to get in there and then ratchet that part open. We have removed the yoke from your bike. You don't have to do this, but it's more just to explain, and it's a bit easier to explain when we've got the part in our hands. So you're going to have to use a variety of different tools. You could use something as simple as a drift, so just something with a nice flat edge that you can work around the tool to literally drift it from its position, so you're walking the bearing through sort of the frame member. There's lots of other tools available, so you could use a slide hammer. These are really technical tools, and effectively, opposed to a hammer hitting, you're actually using the tool to pull, and it means that you can pull frame bearings out from blind positions where you're not able to hit them from the back. They are quite expensive. We've got one from Park here that's a fantastic workshop tool, but others are available. Okay, we're going to use a drift tool to walk the bearing out. So on the inside of this frame area, there's some cutaway sections, which just sort of those are the bits to aim for, really. We're going to try and strike the tool and the bearing together just to drift it in these points. Now, key is that you're going to need a sort of area of support, really strong support around this section of the frame. And that's so that as we're whacking it really quite hard, it means that the bearing is going to move. We're not going to damage this face. So what you can often find is a socket will provide enough support because it'll be round. These ones have got a nice chamfered edge as well. So just be sure that when you're hitting it, that the bearing is moving and you're not just bringing everything together. So tap away, but then do look often. You can see I've started to move the bearing out of this frame piece, and actually it is moving quite evenly, so that's good. I'll keep doing it. So I'm striking just sort of in thirds all the way around the bearing. So I'm not just letting it kind of catch in one place, which obviously kind of make it bigger and harder to loosen. So just walk around with your strikes on the bearing. So the 19mm socket to start with was really good, but it's now, well, the chamfered edge is kind of just being hit by the bearing. So I need to up the size and make sure that I'm still getting lots of support on the frame part, because essentially we want to protect that, and when we're hitting that the load is going through all of that, we're not stressing one part or the other, and we're able to drift all the way around the bearing. So we're going to try this larger socket just as our drift tool. And just like that, the bearing is free. It was just starting to get a bit sticky and a little bit rusty on this side, so good time for replacement. For certain frame designs and certain bearings which are fitted into the frame, the only way of being able to get them out is using a slide hammer. What's a slide hammer? Well, it's a very clever contraption whereby we can slide and pull the bearing out. It's got dedicated collets, all these little fitments here, which slot in behind the bearing. So you slide them through the axis that you can see, and then they open up and wedge, and they try and pull against the inner race. They work really well because they're pulling in a slide, hence slide plane. So they're only pulling in one vector. And for certain frame designs, they're almost the only way to remove the bearings. With this one here, we've got a couple of different ways, because we've got an inner sleeve that sits between the two bearings. So we could, or as I've just clicked, you can move it around. So I could be able to drift the frame bearings out from one side to the other, but I'm going to try and use this slide hammer to pull the bearing out nice and cleanly. Let's see how it goes. Did take some patience, but we got there with a slide hammer, and yeah, it pulled the bearing out in a really nice straight way. So yeah, I think it was worth the time. So we've got the bearing here and it's got the extended inner race section. We've got the dust cap here. And yeah, we can do a little bit more cleaning. There's a few rust spots, probably a bit overzealous with a jet wash at some point. And then we can install the new bearings. We've got the fresh bearing, now time to press it in. This is a kind of asymmetric bearing, for want of a better word. So we've got an outer lip on the inner race that we need to ensure is sticking on the outside. So your bike might be similar, it might be different, but make sure that if you've got a bearing where you've got this outside that's elongated, or sometimes you might have an upper that's elongated, make sure that you're getting it in the correct orientation. So first I'm just going to double check that this bearing seat in this frame member is nice and clean, which it is. Just a little bit of more cleaning there. You could go hog wild, get some degreaser, really rinse it down. I'm just going to add a little bit of grease in there to aid the next time I need to replace the bearing. So just a little bit. This is going to help to help slide the bearing in, but also whilst the bearing's sat in there, that race is steel and this part is aluminium. So you can get bimetallic corrosion where things almost cold set together. So with a little bit of grease on those surfaces, it's going to help prevent that. Okay, I'm just going to push it in. Not that easy, because you need to make sure that it's being pushed in parallel all the way around, because otherwise, again, you could push it in at an angle and then it's not going to sit square, so the suspension's not going to work. Or worse than that, it's going to kind of elongate and deform this bearing seat. So we need to make sure that we're pressing it in really squarely and evenly. So we're going to use the bearing press from Park to make sure that we can compress the part that we're pushing into and the bearing all in one. We've got a really nice flat surface here, so we can definitely load that one, so that's great. The little bit of a puzzle is that this bearing has got this extended, sort of elongated inner race, and that means that we can't just wedge on a really nice, sort of big buttressed structure to just push it in. It means we've got to be careful and have a little bit of a cutaway. But I think I found the right press, or not necessarily the right press, but the press that can work for what we've got. So I've got quite a big selection of different presses here, and that's because I want to be able to pull all the parts together. We're going to slide this through. So we've got these sort of different indentations along here and different points, so I can just slide on the magnet that way. Just going to check that all the parts are in a line, and then just gently start threading the parts in. With our 5mm inserted in the end, we're just going to gently tighten the parts together. Feels like it's sliding in. I'm just double checking that we're sliding in squarely. Looks like we are. Okay, I'm just going to back off and then have another look and see how we're going. Okay, that's gone in quite nicely. With a systematic approach of replacing those bearings that are gone and refreshing those that can last a little bit longer, I think it's a really good task. The suspension feels better with better bearings inside. And whilst it is messy and it can be a bit time consuming and you do have to take a lot of bits of the bike apart, it's not beyond the home mechanic. Okay, there's some specialist tools which do help the process, but again, it's nothing beyond what you'd normally do. So I think it's worth putting in the effort. Let us know in the comments below if you've serviced your suspension and if you've got any extra tips.